Margaret Hensley had not planned to stop at the small grocery store that morning. The 72-year-old widow usually followed the same routine every Tuesday. She would drive into town, buy a few necessities, exchange polite greetings with familiar faces, and return to the quiet cabin where she had lived alone for the last 8 years. But that morning, the sky hung low with gray clouds, and an unexpected chill settled over the mountain valley. Margaret had forgotten to buy coffee the week before, and without it, the house felt even emptier than usual. So she parked her aging sedan outside the store and slowly made her way inside. The little grocery store sat between a hardware shop and a diner. It wasn't large, but it served the scattered mountain community well. Locals chatted near the produce section. Someone laughed near the checkout counters. A radio played soft country music from somewhere in the back. Margaret pushed her cart through the aisles, moving carefully. Age had slowed her steps. Grief had slowed them even more. 8 years earlier, she had buried her husband, Thomas. 47 years of marriage had vanished in a single autumn afternoon when a distracted driver crossed the center line during a rainstorm. People often told her that time healed wounds. Margaret had learned that wasn't entirely true. Time taught people how to carry pain. That was different. She still talked to Thomas sometimes when nobody was around. She still caught herself reaching toward the passenger seat during long drives. She still woke up occasionally expecting to hear his breathing beside her. Those habits never completely disappeared. As she reached for a bag of flour, movement near the front windows caught her attention. A tall man stepped into the store. Several customers glanced toward him. It wasn't difficult to understand why. The newcomer stood well over 6 feet tall and looked as though he belonged in the wilderness rather than a grocery aisle. His dark beard was thick and slightly unkempt. His shoulders were broad. Heavy work boots struck the floor with steady confidence. A faded flannel shirt covered powerful arms weathered by years of outdoor labor. Margaret guessed he was somewhere in his 40s. Maybe 50. The man grabbed a shopping basket and quietly moved through the store. He didn't seem interested in conversation. Yet there was something about him. Something strangely familiar. Margaret frowned. She had never seen him before. At least she didn't think she had. Still, a peculiar feeling settled in her chest. As she continued shopping, she noticed him again near the canned goods. Then near the dairy section. Then near the checkout lanes. Each glimpse deepened the strange sensation. Her heart began to beat faster. The feeling made no sense. Finally, while waiting in line, Margaret found herself standing directly behind him. The mountain man placed several items on the conveyor belt. Bread. Coffee. Eggs. Dog food. Simple things. He seemed completely unaware of her attention. Margaret stared at the side of his face. Something tugged at a memory buried deep beneath years of loss. A smile. A laugh. A summer afternoon. A young boy running through tall grass. Suddenly her breath caught. No. It couldn't be. The memory was too old. Too impossible. Yet the resemblance felt undeniable. Before she could stop herself, she spoke. Her voice emerged barely above a whisper. I've seen you before. The man turned. Warm brown eyes met hers. For a moment, neither spoke. Margaret felt her throat tighten. The eyes. It was the eyes. Not identical. But familiar. Painfully familiar. The mountain man looked puzzled. I don't think so, ma'am, he said kindly. Margaret continued staring. The world around her seemed to fade. The cashier's voice. The radio. The conversations nearby. Everything disappeared beneath a wave of memories. More than 30 years earlier, she and Thomas had lost a son. His name was Daniel. He had been 7 years old. A bright, energetic child who loved fishing, climbing trees, and asking endless questions. One afternoon, while visiting relatives in another state, Daniel had wandered away during a crowded county fair. The family searched frantically. Police searched. Volunteers searched. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. No trace was ever found. No answers. No explanation. Only silence. The disappearance had shattered their lives. Thomas rarely spoke about it afterward. Margaret carried the pain every day. Parents weren't supposed to outlive their children. Parents certainly weren't supposed to spend decades wondering what had happened to them. She blinked hard. The man standing before her was obviously too old to be Daniel. The ages didn't quite fit. Logic told her she was imagining things. Grief often played cruel tricks. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling. The mountain man offered a gentle smile. "Are you all right?" Margaret realized tears had gathered in her eyes. She quickly wiped them away. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "You just remind me of someone." The man's expression changed. His features softened. Instead of looking uncomfortable, he seemed genuinely concerned. "Someone important?" Margaret swallowed. "The most important." For a brief moment, sadness flickered across the man's face. As if he understood loss better than most people. Neither spoke. The silence stretched between them. Then the cashier handed him his receipt. The man picked up his groceries. Before leaving, he turned back toward Margaret. "Sometimes memories find us when we least expect them." The simple sentence struck her deeply. Then he nodded politely and walked out into the gray morning. Margaret stood frozen. Watching him leave. Watching the door close behind him. Watching a complete stranger carry away a feeling she could not explain. She should have forgotten about the encounter. She should have returned home and moved on with her day. Instead, she found herself staring through the front window long after he disappeared from sight. And for reasons she could not understand, she had the overwhelming feeling that this chance meeting was only the beginning. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Margaret drove home through winding mountain roads, but her thoughts never left the stranger from the grocery store. Again and again, she replayed the brief encounter. His eyes. His voice. The strange sadness that had crossed his face when she mentioned someone important. Most of all, she couldn't stop thinking about the feeling that had settled in her chest the moment she saw him. It wasn't recognition. Not exactly. It was something deeper. Something impossible to explain. That evening, rain tapped softly against the cabin windows while Margaret sat alone in her favorite chair. A framed photograph rested on the table beside her. Thomas smiled from the picture. The photo had been taken nearly 20 years before his death. Margaret picked it up. As she often did on lonely nights, she spoke aloud. "You would have told me I was imagining things." A faint smile appeared on her face. Thomas had always been the practical one. Whenever Margaret worried, he would patiently examine every possibility before reaching a conclusion. She missed that. She missed him every day. Outside, darkness settled across the mountains. The forest became a sea of shadows. Normally, Margaret enjoyed the peaceful silence. Tonight, however, the quiet felt different. Restless. Unsettling. Before going to bed, she opened an old wooden chest stored in the corner of the living room. Inside were dozens of photographs. Letters. Birthday cards. School drawings. Pieces of a life preserved through paper and memory. Carefully, she lifted a small photo album. The cover showed signs of age. Its corners were worn. Its pages had yellowed. Inside were pictures of Daniel. Their son. Margaret slowly turned the pages. There he was at 5 years old, proudly holding a fish nearly as large as his arm. There he was climbing onto Thomas's shoulders. There he was laughing so hard his eyes nearly disappeared. Margaret paused. Her heart skipped. The eyes. The stranger's eyes. They carried the same warmth. The same shape. The same quiet kindness. She immediately shook her head. No. The idea was ridiculous. Daniel would have been 39 now. The mountain man looked older. At least mid-40s. Perhaps 50. The numbers simply didn't work. Yet sleep refused to come that night. Again and again, she saw his face. Again and again, she heard his words. Sometimes memories find us when we least expect them. By morning, Margaret made a decision. She would return to town. Not because she expected answers. Not because she believed anything impossible. But because unanswered questions had haunted enough of her life already. She couldn't ignore this one. The next afternoon, she visited the grocery store again. The same cashier stood behind the register. A cheerful young woman named Rebecca. Margaret approached carefully. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "The tall man with the beard who was here yesterday." Rebecca smiled immediately. "Oh, Caleb." "Caleb?" "Yes. Caleb Turner." Margaret repeated the name silently. Caleb. Not Daniel. Not anyone she knew. Still, she listened closely. "Does he live around here?" Rebecca nodded. "About 15 miles up the mountain." "Has he lived here long?" "About 10 years, I think." 10 years. Margaret felt her heart sink slightly. If he had been living there for a decade, then clearly he wasn't her missing son. She almost thanked Rebecca and left. Then the cashier added something unexpected. "Funny thing is, nobody really knows much about him." Margaret looked up. "What do you mean?" Rebecca lowered her voice. "He keeps to himself. Helps people whenever they're in trouble. Fixes fences. Pulls cars out of ditches during winter. Brings firewood to elderly neighbors." She smiled. "He's probably the nicest person around here." "That sounds wonderful." "It is. But he never talks about his past." Margaret felt a strange chill. "Never?" Rebecca shook her head. "No family. No old friends. No stories about where he came from." Margaret thanked her and walked back outside. The mountain stretched beneath a clear blue sky. A cool breeze rustled the trees. Something about the conversation lingered in her thoughts. No family. No past. No stories. For the next week, Margaret tried to forget about it. She truly did. But fate seemed to have other plans. 3 days later, her truck refused to start outside the post office. The engine sputtered. Coughed. Then died completely. Margaret sighed. She stepped out and lifted the hood despite knowing almost nothing about engines. A familiar voice spoke behind her. "Having trouble?" She turned. Caleb stood there. The mountain man. For a moment, both seemed equally surprised. Then he smiled. Margaret laughed softly. Apparently. Without hesitation, Caleb moved beside the truck. Within minutes he was examining wires and connections. His hands moved with confidence. Like someone who had spent years fixing things. Finally he tightened something near the battery. "Try now." Margaret climbed inside. The engine roared to life immediately. Her eyes widened. "You fixed it. Nothing serious." She stepped back out. "Thank you." Caleb shrugged. "Happy to help." For several seconds neither moved. Then Margaret surprised herself. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" The invitation slipped out naturally. Caleb hesitated. Almost as though he rarely accepted such offers. Finally he nodded. "Sure." An hour later they sat on her porch overlooking the valley. The afternoon sun painted golden light across the mountains. For the first time, they truly talked. Not deeply at first. Weather. Fishing. Mountain life. Simple things. Yet Margaret quickly noticed something unusual. Whenever conversation drifted toward childhood or family, Caleb became guarded. Not rude. Not defensive. Just distant. Like someone staring through a locked door. Eventually she asked gently. "Do you have family somewhere?" A shadow crossed his face. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he looked toward the horizon. "I don't know." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" Caleb took a slow breath. "When I was younger, I was found after an accident." Her heart stopped. He continued quietly. "I had injuries. Memory problems. The world seemed suddenly very still. I remembered pieces of my life." His voice grew softer. "But not enough." Margaret gripped her coffee cup. Every instinct in her body screamed that something extraordinary was unfolding. Caleb stared into the distance. "I spent years trying to figure out who I was." A painful smile touched his lips. "I never found the answers." Margaret could barely breathe. The mountains around them remained silent. The wind moved gently through the trees. And for the first time since meeting the mysterious mountain man, she began to wonder whether fate had brought him into her life for a reason. A reason neither of them could yet understand. And deep inside her heart, a hope she had buried more than 30 years earlier slowly began to awaken.